Thank you so much for coming. My name is Pam Sador. Welcome to Radnor Memorial Library. Our partner this evening is Radnor Historical Society, and also Tom Ellis. Thank you for the podcast this evening, and Vince from Studio 21. Tonight we also have Main Point Books here. Emily is here if you'd like to purchase a book. We're actually selling 2 books. You've written 13. Let me tell you about our author this evening. Tonight we welcome Philadelphia-based author Thom Nickels, but I found out that he grew up in Chester County. He is the author of a new book. Show and tell, yes. The new book is Philadelphia Mansions, Stories and Characters Behind the Walls, published just a few months ago by History Press. Nickels is the author of 13 books, including Philadelphia Architecture and Literary Philadelphia, A History of Prose and Poetry in the City of Brotherly Love. He is also a published poet, and he has been published by the Huffington Post, the New Oxford Review, Philadelphia Magazine, and, of course, the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's a columnist for PJ Media in Los Angeles and a weekly columnist for the Philadelphia Free Press and the Irish Edition. In May 2017, Thom Nickels was the featured speaker at Walt Whitman's 198th birthday celebration in the poet's old home on Nichols Street in Camden. I'd love to hear more about that. So please welcome to Radnor Memorial Library, Thom Nickels.
Thank you, Pam, very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I know we got a bit of a late start. There's a curious quote in Scripture, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," and it's also rendered as, "In my Father's house there are many houses," but I think I prefer the word mansion. According to the famous Swiss mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, there are mansions in the afterlife. Swedenborg wrote that he was taken up into heaven by angels who showed him cities of great splendor and light, as well as houses both great and small where the deceased go. Swedenborg says that the kind of life we lead on earth will determine the kind of house we get in the life to come, meaning that some of us will be assigned simple Section 8 style apartments, while others will bask in an old city-style row house, a blue and gray tinted Cape Cod, or a mansion of considerable splendor. Now, during his heavenly mansion tour, Swedenborg said that he was sometimes able to see decorative elements on the various mansions move as if they were alive. And they changed with ever fresh beauty and symmetry, he wrote. Such changes can keep going on indefinitely, one after another, even to eternity. Realtors term mansions as houses that have at least 8,000 square feet of floor space. Merriam-Webster's definition is less definitive, simply stating that a mansion is a large and impressive house, the large house of a wealthy person. In my book, the definition of a mansion is expanded, even turned on its head. The Barnes Museum as mansion, the Mormon Temple as mansion, the Walt Whitman House is mansion. The President's House at Independence Hall, that's not really a president's house, as mansion, and so on. It's fitting, I like to imagine, that my book begins with an account of the time I spent in the Senator Charles Sumner House on Hancock Street in Boston's Beacon Hill. Now, I felt that a nod to Boston, Philadelphia's sister city to the north, and some 50 years older, was appropriate. I lived in the summer house for 6 months when I was 21, and in Boston, fulfilling my alternative service contract as a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. The room I rented was the second floor front bedroom, where it is said that the famous Massachusetts senator and abolitionist spent months recuperating after he was caned within an inch of his life on the floor of the Senate by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks. Sumner's reputation as an orator was legendary. He once gave a 5-hour speech on the floor of the Senate on the immorality of extending slavery into the United States territory of Kansas, and in so doing, he lashed out at Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. The situation enraged Representative Brooks, who sprung into action. Southern newspapers applauded the attack. The Richmond Whig reported, "The only regret we feel is that Mr. Brooks did not employ a slave whip instead of a stick. And we think we live in savage political times." The Federal-style 4-story townhouse was where Sumner lived for 30 years of his life. When I rented a room there, my first impression was that it had remained perfectly intact from the 19th century. The dark parlor was filled with old furniture and rugs. There was an old mahogany desk off to the side that I later discovered was where Sumner wrote his speeches. A sense of mystery penetrated this house. Certainly the landlady's general demeanor added to the feeling that this was no ordinary abode, but some kind of cross between Hitchcock and Rod Serling. Now, my furnished room consisted of a washstand in one corner with built-in tiles to prevent splashing. There was also a 4-poster bed, a 19th century antique wardrobe closet, and an out-of-commission mantelpiece topped with a vase holding artificial flowers. While lying in bed one night, I thought I saw one of the artificial flowers on the mantelpiece leaning in the opposite direction from the rest, like the flower in William Blake's poem, The Sick Rose. Now, immediately after noticing the flower, I observed how the other flowers, working together in symphony, leaned toward the hurt, bent flower as if on a rescue mission, and then drew it back towards the group with the force of what I perceived to be love. The strange room in the even stranger house seemed to be demonstrating to me the healing power of love. But how was this possible? In this room, where possibly Senator Sumner's father, mother, and all of his sisters died, I was experiencing something beyond the pale. It was as if the walls themselves were giving up a part of their lived human history. The consciousness of long-forgotten events that happened here were, in a sense, breaking through and coming at me like random psychic darts. Some things cannot be explained. Whenever I visit Boston, I make it a point to visit 20 Hancock Street on Beacon Hill. So, what can some old houses teach us? And what, if anything, can we feel when we enter them? Do some old houses stand mute, while others, like the Sumner House, exude something that can sometimes, on very rare conditions, be experienced paranormally? I am not a fan of so-called haunted houses with their contrived black cape lantern tours and curiosity seekers looking for flashes of ectoplasm. But I do know that in writing this book, some of the people I talked to would bring the subject up as if it was part of the baggage of owning an old home. Which brings me to the Philadelphia Morris House at 225 South 8th Street. This home was once the home of one of Philadelphia's oldest families, a line going back to 1685 when Anthony Morris was mayor of the city. Anthony Morris should not be confused with Robert Morris, signer of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. While there's no relation between the two families, the Morris House bears a special relation to the first White House built at 6th and Market by Robert Morris, who later handed it over to Washington and Jefferson in 1790 when Philadelphia, for a short 10 years, became the capital of the nation. The first White House, which was demolished in 1832, was a mirror image of the Morris House, the only noticeable difference being in the number of dormers, the number of entrance steps, and the treatment of window heads. During the Revolution, a musket fired by the British managed to shoot holes in the pendulum of the William Eric clock that still stands in the first floor hall of the house. Today, the Morris House can properly be called the real president's house, as opposed to the modernist subway stop design posing as a president's house with its 9 cluttered open-air slave reenactment videos and grade school-like teaching storyboards fastened on brick and granite walls. The New York Times found the new president's house, which was opened in 1910, to be an ineffectual mismatch that has reached new lows. The building is certainly cold and conjures up T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Man, and even the now deceased Tom Wolfe's view of modern architecture in From Bauhaus to Our House. Wolfe maintained that many of these cold, idealist buildings are the products of architects who only want to out-avant-garde the competition. I might add that politically correct psychobabble has already affected the world of interior design. A 2013 issue of House Beautiful details how the term master bedroom is being replaced by owner's suite or owner's bedroom because the word master has negative connotations in terms of gender. Now, when I interviewed Julie Morris of Morris House fame several years ago, she told me what it was like growing up in the house before her family moved to a farm in 1932. As we walked from room to room, we headed to the stairway and began to climb it when suddenly Julie stopped on a landing so she could look out a window. "That looks familiar," she said, pointing to an old house standing alone among a sprawling Pennsylvania hospital addition. I remember looking at that house as a girl. She then reminded me that the woodwork is all original. The venerable railings, like dense material pathways, straight into the 18th century, when Jefferson, Washington, or Franklin, while stepping up or down the Morris House stairs, applied their hands to these same railings for support. Images of the Founding Fathers climbing the Morris House stairs reminded me of what Washington said of the first president's house, the one owned by Robert Morris, as being the best single home in the city. If Washington could come back, he would feel right at home here. Now, when Julie showed me the attic, there was excitement evident in her voice. "The ghosts were up here," she said. There was definitely creaking and all kinds of noises. There were definitely ghosts on the 3rd floor, and there was always a stairway that could come down. I never went up there alone. Someone was always with me. It was very dark, and it has some windows, but it runs all the way back over my old room. There are actually 3 separate buildings on the Morris House site. Today, the house is known as the Morris House Hotel and M Restaurant. You might call it an inn in the classic sense, but before it became an inn, it was owned by an energy company. It was at that time when the historic floorboards took a beating. I was told you could still see little carving scars executed by various styles of women's high heels. So let's talk a minute about historic Strawberry Mansion. Judge William Lewis bought the property from Joseph Swift and his wife in August of 1783. Lewis then began an extensive remodeling project, completing the enlarging of the former farmhouse in 1789. An opening party was held in 1789. The estate soon began to be known as Somerville. Lewis was an iconoclastic force in the American legal world. One of his most famous cases involving treason was his defense of Aaron Burr. As an aide to both Washington and Hamilton, he was also instrumental in writing the first law in the United States abolishing slavery. A compulsive smoker, Judge Lewis's discarded cigar butts dotted the ground around his person like an array of fallen seedlings. His critics said that it was outrageous the way he even desecrated his courtroom with his tobacco. His doctor warned him that his too much smoking and too much drinking would kill him. Even his friends deplored the tobacco habit. His wife found it unforgivable. After Judge Hemphel's residency, the mansion became a dairy farm. Misguided legends have it that at this time the estate began to be called Strawberry Mansion, probably because of strawberry crops. But the estate was known as Strawberry Mansion during Judge Hemphel's time, probably because William Penn himself titled the area Strawberry Hill in his 17th century maps. Around 1867, the building was used for a variety of purposes, including an Italian restaurant where Henry James once visited, a sailor's rendezvous spot, a rumored of speakeasy, and a beer garden. Then the house fell into disrepair and social disgrace. The city threatened to tear down the building, but the mansion found a savior in the Committee of 1926, a group of women dedicated to preserving colonial life history. They opened the mansion to the public as an historic house museum in 1931. Now, a few years ago, the mansion experienced problems with patrons of the Dell Music Center. Suddenly, there were rows of cars and SUVs parking illegally on the mansion lawn. Despite the yellow tape prohibiting rogue vehicles from entering the mansion's property, people were getting out of their cars, moving the barricades, and cutting the yellow tape so that they could park wherever they pleased. These were not Dell ticket holders, but bellicose tailgaters who set up cook ranges, tents, and pieces of outdoor furniture on mansion property. Barbecue smoke began to rise over the treetops as slabs of meat were piled on the grills. And then, of course, there was the trash and the debris aftermath. The mansion successfully petitioned the city to correct these problems, so as of the summer before last, strawberry lawns were wiped clean. Now, they say that a house is not really a house until someone is born in it and someone dies in it. We have to consider the life of an architect named Thomas Neville, who designed Germantown's Mount Pleasant mansion, which was once purchased by Benedict Arnold for his wife Peggy Shippen, although the couple never lived there. Neville founded the city's first architectural school, but abandoned the school to join the fight for America's independence. He wound up designing coffins and war materials. One day, in search of romance, he met a widow named Mrs. Weed. When Mrs. Weed died, she left no provisions for her cherished husband Thomas, but allowed her son, a 21-year-old stay-at-home, to keep the house for himself while giving his stepfather the boot. So Neville found himself on the streets and died in an obscure rooming house. His former status as a Philadelphia mover and shaker turned to ash. It's important, I think, to also consider Stephen Gerrard and the house he called home at 2101 Shunk Street. Gerrard, the primary financial backer of the War of 1812, fell in love with his housekeeper, the beautiful, long, black-haired Mary Lum. Stephen married Mary, but kept the marriage a secret from his family because of the social caste mismatch. He eventually stopped hiding Mary, and his family came to accept her, but then something happened. Mary became glum, melancholy, hostile, and violent. Stephen consulted a doctor, and opium was given to Mary, but her condition only got worse. She was finally committed to Pennsylvania Hospital. She remains buried somewhere on the grounds of Pennsylvania Hospital, but there's no grave marker per se, just a plaque on one of the hospital walls. Now, a saint named St. Catherine of Siena once observed, "Nothing great is ever achieved without much enduring." The Dominican nuns who inhabited the former Elstow Manor in Elkins Park were a sight to see in their long flowing robes. If anything, the Elkins Park nuns reminded the casual observer of a certain age of John Huston's 1957 movie, Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, starring Robert Mitchum as a U.S. Marine stranded on a South Pacific island with a nun played by Deborah Kerr. Renamed the Dominican Retreat House, the former Elstow Manor's 42-acre estate was built in 1898 by William L. Elkins, who along with Peter A.B. Widener built the Philadelphia Railroad and came to be known as a rare architectural and design treasure. With its frescoed ceilings, exquisitely hand-carved mahogany panels, French crystal chandeliers, and handsome marble columns, the manor was the epitome of lush excess in the Gilded Age. Located in Cheltenham Township, the one area of the city that had more millionaires per square inch than in any other place in the country, Elkins's industrial baron-class neighbors included people like Jay Cook, John B. Stetson, and John Wanamaker. The Elkins family sold the mansion to the Dominican nuns in 1932. The nuns sold the mansion in 2009, which for the nuns was the end of an era. Not enough women were interested in coming to the mansion for religious retreats, and the numbers of nuns had also dwindled, a change that some, and I emphasize some, attribute to the Second Vatican Council of 1962, a time when seminaries and convents began to empty out, and when Catholic Church architecture seemed to take a nosedive, when beautiful churches were stripped of their high altars, statues, and mosaics, when potted plants were put in place of traditional Catholic artwork, when crucifixes were transformed into geometric plus signs, baptismals into hot tubs, and when modern Gucci-style nuns in lipstick began talking about God, Mother Goddess. Well, talk about a revolution that really was. A stone's throw away from Elstow is Peter A.B. Widener's Lynwood Hall, often referred to as the Old Gray Lady. After the death of the last surviving Widener family member in 1943, the mansion was eventually sold to Carl McIntyre's Faith Theological Seminary in 1952. McIntyre, famous for his noisy PR stunts, told the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1993, "I've preserved this place for 41 years, and I'll preserve it for another 41, but I need money to pay off the mortgage." Well, that didn't happen, and the mansion was sold to a Dr. Richard Yoon, founder of the First Korean Church of New York. In its heyday, the 110-room estate, modeled after Prior Park in Bath, England, had an art gallery where Peter Widener hung his paintings in the floor-to-ceiling European tradition. Peter was lucky that his mansion never burned to the ground, as did John Wanamaker's mansion, Lindenhurst, on York Road near Washington Lane. Wanamaker lost his vast art collection in the fire, although he had several other mansions in Cape May Point, London, Paris, Florida, and New York City to keep his spirits afloat. Peter Widener was plagued by something far more serious than a fire, the Titanic disaster, which claimed the lives of his son George and grandson Harry. His art gallery was pared down after his death in 1915 at age 80. The endless acreage around Lynwood Hall is enclosed by a fence, with the grounds overgrown with trees and weeds so that the area resembles a wild zoo. The foreboding estate is said to have a number of wild animals roaming about inside, with cantankerous guard dogs, perhaps pit bulls, employed by the present owner. Irving Stone's biography of Michelangelo, The Agony and the Ecstasy, comes to mind when we look at the fate of Bryn Mawr's Larhonda, the Mediterranean-style mansion designed by Addison Meisner in 1929 for Percival Forader, a successful leather merchant. Meisner's work is well known, although the architect died in poverty. I don't know what it is about all these architects dying in poverty. When Percival died in 1969, his family sold the estate to Villanova. Then, in March of 2009, the estate was sold to a man who withheld his name, choosing instead to hide behind a corporate shield, but who was later revealed to be a certain Ken Kostenbaum, a.k.a. Scrooge out of Dickens. At least this is what his critics called him, because his only goal seemed to be to have Larhonda destroyed. He wanted Larhonda destroyed despite a very generous offer from a man named Benjamin Waugh, who offered to move Larhonda at his own expense so that Mr. Kostenbaum could build his McMansion with an indoor hockey rink on the grounds. Kostenbaum refused the offer, and Larhonda was destroyed in October of 2009, proving once again that money doesn't buy class. Preservationists did everything but set themselves on fire in the manner of Buddhist monks during the Vietnam War to save the building, but all efforts failed. There are plenty of conventional classic mansions in the book. However, there's Woodmont on the main line, once the home of Mother and Father Divine and headquarters of the Peace Mission movement. Father Divine's death preceded Mother's death, so Mother spent decades in Woodmont alone, but attended by an army of sentry women in red vests and little black berets. These security ladies watched your every step, and when you were invited to Woodmont to share in a banquet supper, where the platters of food were never allowed to touch the table when they were passed from person to person. Mother Divine was a sweet, down-to-earth person. We were first introduced after I observed her walking down Woodmont's grand staircase dressed in a billowing white gown. Here, I thought, is the American version of Buckingham Palace. After the meal, we went into Father Divine's old office, which she told me was modeled after the Kennedy Oval Office in the White House. It was such a time capsule that I expected to see small JFK Jr. crawl out from under Father Divine's desk at any moment. If the walls at Woodmont could talk, they would tell how Jim Jones of Jonestown fame came to visit Mother Divine with a large number of his followers. In the late spring of 1971, having achieved new heights in People's Temple business expansion and gratifying personal success as a traveling evangelist, Jones contacted Mother Divine and asked to visit her at Woodmont. She was agreeable. In her new role as head of the Peace Mission, Mother Divine often received visitors. Jones chose about 200 of his most dedicated, energetic followers to accompany him and prepped them rigorously before departure. He explained that Father Divine had failed and that he had died before completing his life's work. Jones had come to understand that it was now his call to lead Mother Divine's people down the same socialist path followed by People's Temple. The goals of both movements were the same: achievement of economic and social equality. Sounds very fine on the outside. Temple buses took almost 3 days to make the trip. Stops were made only for gas and bathroom breaks. When they arrived in Philadelphia, Temple members were housed in Peace Mission apartments. Jones himself stayed at Woodmont, and all the guests were taken on a tour of the property. Afterward, there was an elaborate banquet where the dessert was ice cream shaped like flower petals. Mother Divine invited Jones to make a few remarks. He praised the ministry of Father Divine. It was a very pleasant evening. The temple visitors stayed a second day, during which Jones spent time talking with Mother Divine, and apparently he was dissatisfied. That night, there was another gathering for dinner, a barbecue with all the trappings, and Jones stood up to speak again. His tone was critical, intense. He criticized the Peace Mission, its luxurious trappings, and told the assembly that Father Divine had conferred his mantle on Jim Jones. His spirit has come to rest in my body, he said, and the Peace Mission must follow me. Mother Divine took offense and ordered Jones and his people to leave at once. They did leave immediately, but they also managed to take about a dozen older Peace Mission members with them, converts who bought into the People's Temple message. And those converts, by the way, all died very soon after arriving in their new California People's Temple home. Jones explained his failed mission to his California followers by saying that what happened was not his fault. Jones insisted that when Mother and he were alone, Mother tore open her blouse and was adamant that they have sex. Jones said she flaunted her breasts in my face, but I wasn't tempted. Even after this, Jones didn't give up, but continued to send Peace Mission members letters with the headline, "This may be your last chance for life." Mother Divine's last years were strange indeed, and it is thought that she eventually became a prisoner of the red-vested sentry ladies who thought they knew what was best for her. Now, imagine a mansion out of Grimm's fairy tales, and you have the Lock Erie estate in Fraser, Chester County, designed by Addison Hutton and built by William E. Lockwood, the nation's chief manufacturer of the detachable men's collar in 1865. Lockwood didn't invent the paper men's collar, though. That was done by a woman, Hannah Montague, from Troy, New York, because she was tired of having to deal with her husband's ring around the collar. Detachable collars were all the rage in 1862. William Lockwood had the gift of gab, but unfortunately he had it to excess. People were warned not to start a conversation with him, especially about business, unless they planned on being stuck with him for a long, long time. One simply couldn't get away from him. His brother, E. Dunbar, was a well-respected manufacturer who was punched out by a business associate in one of the rooms of the Union League. To his credit, E. Dunbar did not retaliate but took the high road, and so the fight ended. E. Dunbar at the time was described as someone who had a lot of jerky bodily movements, although the source of his condition was never revealed. Lock Erie was threatened many times with an invasion by tramps who roamed the countryside. These were mostly Civil War veterans who couldn't find work. Societal attitudes at that time categorized these tramps as evil. Society felt no compassion for the down and out. If you were poor and unemployed, you were evil, no questions asked. And so the armies of tramps were common in the fields and glens and forests of this part of Chester County, where General Washington once marched on his way to Valley Forge. The tramps were attracted by Lockwood's big, beautiful Victorian Gothic blue limestone mansion, and they wanted in. But Lockwood invented a state-of-the-art, multifaceted burglar alarm system to keep them out. Whether any tramps got in and what they did when they got in is not known. Lockwood once hosted poet James Whitcomb Riley during one of the poet's national poetry tours. Riley was known as the people's poet. Critics lamented that there was never any sting in anything that Riley wrote, and Riley himself that he had never written a word that could not be read by anyone. The mansion was once the grandest estate in Chester County. When I was a high school student, its legacy was shrouded in mystery. We didn't know much about the house except that two old women lived there, the daughters of the paper collar guy. Not 1 month out of high school, I landed my first freelance newspaper assignment and went to Lock Erie to interview one of the sisters. Mrs. Riley, yes, she had been married, but not to the poet, told me everything, perhaps too much, because when I published my story in the staid Wayne Suburban Times, I reported that Mrs. Riley's brother, Bill Jr., had once dressed up in a ball gown and descended Lock Erie's grand staircase to much applause during a fancy party. Mrs. Riley called me later on the phone, and in a voice so exasperated sounding that she could barely get the words out, she laid into me, although politely, like a knife into soft butter. We had just finished dinner in the Nickels house, so my whole family was within hearing range. "Why, oh why did you publish that?" Mrs. Riley said. "That was not supposed to be published." Not that. Why did you tell them that? But that, I did not say to her, was the highlight of the piece. Never mind that you never said, I did say this to her, you never said, don't write what I am about to tell you. Just keep it to yourself. You never said that, so I didn't know, but I am sorry you feel bad, even though I did not say this. I don't know why you feel so ashamed. You should write about politics from now on, Mrs. Riley said. You should. And that was that. We hung up, and a few months later, I read in the daily local news that she had died, and ever since then, her words have haunted me. I did not include the story of her brother in the elaborate ball gown in the book. I am superstitious that way, but I feel safe telling you the story now. So I would be happy to take questions, and I can also go through some images on the screen with you. I guess they'll pop up automatically. I just need to touch. There we go. This is an interesting photo. You can't really see it too well, but obviously that is Jim Jones on the right. And here we have. I'm not sure whether this is a peace mission person that could have been in Gladwin, or whether it's an ordinary People's Temple member. This is the ceiling of Elstow Manor. This would be the ceiling of the music room. This is when I took a tour there. And this is Mr. William E. Lockwood of Lock Erie Mansion, and I talked about his brother E. Dunbar. And so I don't think he has a paper collar on, but maybe he does. There's no ring around the collar, although that would be hard to tell. This is William Lockwood Jr. This is the guy who attended that fancy party. I think this is a really nice photograph. I found this in the Chester County Historical Society. And this is an interesting exhibit. This is the William E. Lockwood exhibit at the Centennial celebration. This was his envelope making machine. So it's a big machine to make something so small. Here we have Edith. I guess Edith Lockwood. This was about, I would say, about 1915, between 1915 and 1920. This is a fountain in the back of Lock Erie. This fountain was alive and well when I was a kid. I lived not far from Lock Erie, so I could ride my bike up every now and then with my brother and sort of scout around the premises. But this fountain was barely operating then. Today, it's a completely dried up. And this is the rear of Lock Erie. This was an artificial pond that used to have a great statue of Neptune in the center, and there's no pond currently. Now, I put this in because this is at Gerrard and Broad Street. This is an old convent that was torn down, and I use this as an example when I talk about sacred architecture. Obviously, it's from the 40s or 50s. And this is another convent picture. This is an example of the current President's House on Market Street in front of Independence Hall. And as you can see, it's a skeletal modernist design, and from this angle, it really could be a SEPTA regional rail exit or entryway. It really, there's no there, as Gertrude Stein would say. It has no soul. And this is the house that Benedict Arnold never lived in, designed by Thomas Neville, who was conned by the widow, Mrs. Weed. And this is historic Strawberry Mansion, and the current head of the guided tours, Tyson Gardner. I thought I would throw this in. It's a period piece. We have a rear view of Elstow Mansion. which, as I said, became the Dominican Retreat House. This is the cover that's used on the back of my book as well. And I really like this picture. This is an old picture of Father and Mother Divine's banquet dinners. And so this is obviously when he just married his new bride, which he claimed was a reincarnation of his first wife, who died a natural death. And Edna Retchings was from Canada, and she actually sought Father Divine out. She found him some way and just announced to him that she had been guided to him. This is the official story now. Peace mission members, like the Shakers, did not indulge in marital lovemaking. So everybody was expected to be celibate. But I've heard stories to the contrary, but that's another story. Here we have a much better view of the music room in the Elstow Mansion. And here is the Mars House, the current site of the M Restaurant and Bed and Breakfast. So this is what, essentially, this is what the President's house would have looked like at 6th and Market. I enclosed this because this is a fascinating photo. I think these are tramps after the Civil War in the 1800s. And they're camping and forming a circle of comradeship. But I always thought it odd that they all have white shirts on and jackets. So I guess today they wear knapsacks, but then they wore white shirts and jackets. So this is a picture of Mother Divine and myself and one of the Century women named Miss Faith, who actually greeted me at the door. And when I asked her if I could take photos, she looked at me as if I had said something so horrible. So I had to promise her that I wouldn't take photos in the mansion, but Mother Divine wanted our picture taken. So this was a notable exception. Claire Booth Luce, just as a throw-in, as a 1950s icon. And I should have taken this photo out, but it's here, nevertheless. This is the Samuel J. Letty House at 12th, 13th, and Locust. It's an historic place. Joseph Letty was a physician, and this used to be a kind of a hospital with operating rooms on the upper floors. It later became the Poor Richard Club, and the adjacent building became the Charles Morris Price School of Advertising and Journalism. This, we don't need to see that. That's, okay. This is Larhonda before the destruction. So you see, it's just waiting for the wrecking cranes. And so you can almost feel the clock ticking.
What's its address?
It's in the book. I don't know the address offhand. The address of Larhonda?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. It's in the book. Oh no, because the next picture tells it all. There you go. Of course it's not there anymore. But what I like to say that this is the most peaceful protest in the history of Western civilization. Have you ever seen anything more polite? So, and another view of Loch Erie. This would be the front view, obviously. This is the grand stairway in Loch Erie. Of course, the walls are denuded. The house lay vacant for many years, and it was the place where two motorcycle groups used to sort of go in there and bring their cycles and camp out and sleep and have parties. And in one instance, there was a fight between the warlocks and the pagans. Somebody was shot in the house. You can still see motorcycle tracks in one of the upper floors. I'm sure they've been removed now because the house has been thoroughly redone. It's now a wedding venue place. But the house really had a dicey history for a long time. Here we have Lynwood Hall. Because this is the one that's surrounded by a gate and ferocious dogs and out-of-control weeds. I mean, it like literally looks like something in South America or something. It's just over the top. I forget where this library is from. I think it's in Strawberry Mansion. And as an example, as if you needed one, of a real motorcycle gang. This was an interesting thing that we discovered in the Elstow Mansion when it was a convent. This is a confessional. And these old wooden things are really great. On one side it says priest, and on the other side it says penitent. So I don't know what they're being used for currently. But they're very, very cozy and cool. Here we have the president's house again. It looks a little bit better at night with the lights. So there is some style to it. Now, this I didn't say anything about Henry McElhenney, but this is a picture of his mansion on Rittenhouse Square, and done by an artist named Chuck Schultz for the book. This is a picture of the Charles Sumner's house on Hancock Street in Boston. You see it in this on the right side. I lived on the second floor front. This is the Walt Whitman House in Camden. Coming up is Whitman's 200th birthday, so there are a lot of celebrations around that. This house, after Whitman died, it was sold to a family, and there was a kid who put a sign in the window. It said, "Live rabbits sold here." So there was a period of time when nobody here honored Whitman. This house was just, it fell into total neglect. In fact, there was a bust of the poet in the backyard done by a famous artist that was found just kind of rumbled among the weeds as if it was a trash can.
When did they save it?
It got better once they named the bridge after Walt Whitman. But of course, that was a big controversial issue because Whitman's poetry was very sensual, very earthy, with a lot of homoerotic overtones. And people were quite shocked by it. There was a lot of protest about renaming the bridge in his name. I believe most of the opposition came from a Camden Monsignor who led an extensive letter writing campaign. So you had all these Catholic school children writing letters to the editor, etc. So it was a different time. And I don't see an arrow, so I think we're stuck at the Whitman House, but I think that's very appropriate. But I visited Whitman's house in the 70s, and in those days, everything that he owned was out in the open. His rocking chair, his old bedroom slippers, his old fur coat, his old blankets. You could sit in his chair, you could touch the blankets, you could go upstairs into his bedroom where he died, you could lay on the bed. Of course, now it's completely under total. So, I mean, you can't breathe in there now, much less sit on the bed. So, I would be happy to take questions.
What happened to the Dominican Retreat House?
It was just recently sold, and I don't have all of the owner information at the tip of my tongue, but it's been saved, and it's a very good
I
thing.
know, I've been there, it's beautiful.
Yes.
And
isn't it?
another question, why, with the President's House, what was the idea behind such a stupid-looking structure? I mean,
Well,
is that laziness?
We live, as you know, in a very politically correct age. And so the President's House suddenly became not about the presidents, but the slaves that they owned. Well, we all know that slavery was immoral and it was a bad thing. So I say build a museum to slavery, but keep the President's House as the President's House. It's very simple. Well, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I would be happy to sign books if you'd like to purchase one. Oh, yes, what?
The 200th birthday of Whitman, since you were involved in the 100th.
Yes, I will be giving a talk at the City Institute Library, and the title of the talk is Walt Whitman in Camden and Philadelphia. I will be giving the same talk at Historic Strawberry Mansion on May 18th. So I'll be giving this talk. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Pam. Thank you very much.